welcome, Boirun, bienvenidos a todos. So excited to have you all here tonight for our third and final section of Sephardic Judaism in Republican Turkey. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications of La Hermandad Sephardic de America. We're so excited to have you all here tonight with the amazing Nesi Altaras, a Master's of Political Science student at McGill University. Just to remind you all, this is all through our brand new Sephardic Digital Academy initiative, a wonderful new repository of Sephardic history, education, culture, Torah, Ladino language, and so much more. If you're ever interested in learning more about what we're doing, please feel free to reach out. You can contact us at info@sephardicbrotherhood.com, and also find more on our website, sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. It's now really my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Nesi Altaras, to help begin the series. Nesi, whenever you're ready.
Welcome. Oh. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
And we can hear you. I just have to spotlight.
Sounds good. Welcome everyone to the last part of this series. It's been a learning experience for me as well, doing this series with you. And today, again, there's too much stuff to cover. And we also are faced with a new problem that we didn't face before, which is we're still in part of this era, and because it hasn't closed, it's really hard to tell the last part, the 2004 to present part, how to analyze it and what to make of it, because it's still it's the ongoing period, basically. So we'll talk about that. So in the plan that I presented to you before, we began with the one-party republic. Then we moved on to what we could call the Second Republic that ended with the coup of 1980. And this period I've decided to call the Whiplash Republic, because we're going to go rapidly from the coup government and political violence preceding it to massive liberalization, mostly economic, but also to some extent social, and then really a shift, a rapid shift towards Islamism. So we're going to have, for the Jewish community at least, and generally possibly for Turkey, some of the worst times and the best times and then the worst times and the best times, and a lot of alternating. And we'll see how our community has fared through this period. Some of the highlights are listed here: economic globalization, the founding of the Quincentennial Foundation, the changing nature of anti-Semitism in Turkey, and the rise of the current government. I thought it was fitting to start with this picture. This was an image used about an article, for an article about Turkey in The Economist recently. I think it really captures the reality of Turkey and the way that Jews have been active agents in helping whitewash that reality, a sad fact that our community has only recently begun to face. So today I'm going to tell a story that goes back to the 70s first, something that I didn't have time for and didn't really fit our narrative last time, but will take us through the 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, almost to the present. And I didn't start the story of Jews as public relations agents for the state last time, as it comes into its own really in the period that we're going to look at today. And in telling this story, I'm going to rely a lot on, once again, the work of Rafat Wali, as well as this new book that came out in this March in 2020 by Mark Baer. And we're going to start with the 70s, after the Cyprus crisis and the beginning of terror attacks by a group named Asala, who used these terrorist acts to force recognition of the Armenian genocide. We see that the state has a more strained relationship with the Greeks and the Armenians. But this brings two things for Jews. It, first of all, brings a strained environment for minorities in general, but also an opportunity, somewhat, to become the government's favorite minority, the one that is closer. And Jews basically start taking up the role of the model minority of Turkey. And really the first recruit we can talk about for the state PR operation is Jacques Camhier, a wealthy businessman. And him and then lay council president Yaakov Sid first tried to promote Turkey in Europe in the mid-late 70s after particularly the Cyprus crisis. But then they realized there was a bigger fish to fry, and that was American Jewish organizations. So for somewhat anti-Semitic reasons, but also for normal reasons, we see the Turkish government is very convinced that these organizations, like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, AIPAC, really hold the keys in Washington, that they are extremely influential. And the government asked basically these Jewish leaders to do that work for them, to contact these organizations and help sway them in favor of Turkey. Of course, this means in favor of the state of Turkey and whatever the state deems is correct at the time. And they simply had to do it. While Jacques Camhier may have been more of a true believer in this cause than others, in their minds, this would preserve what remained of a relationship with the state, but with the Jewish community, and it would supposedly help alleviate the Jewish community's problems by fostering somewhat of a closer relationship with the state, which is, I would say, a strategy that keeps failing and failing, but at the time didn't seem so. And there's also the issue that these people were not really in a position to refuse such a direct request from the state. Most of these people would be rocking the boat by doing so and endangering their own pretty well-functioning business interests. So they went along with it. They argued that they were serving their country and doing their duty as citizens. And in a way, they were also performing Turkishness by presenting the Turkish point of view, by praising Turks as in this cover, tolerant and the sultans of the Ottoman Empire as saviors. They were trying to highlight the good things, the positive sides of the minority Turkish relationship. And the Turkish government thought that doing so would obscure claims of the Armenian genocide or mistreatment of Greeks, just by the virtue of saying we're not bad to all minorities, hence Jewish lobbyists in favor of Turkey. And I want to turn to this picture that I put up here. So this man next to Jimmy Carter is then Turkish ambassador to Washington, Shukri Elekta, a still respected former diplomat and former parliamentarian for the opposition party CHP. And he comes into the story in 1979, when, according to White House political advisor Stuart Eisenstadt, when he heard of the construction of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and that it would mention Armenians, Elekta visits Eisenstadt and says that Jews have lived in Turkey for centuries and that Turkey is a very tolerant country, and finally gets to the point that if Armenians are mentioned in this museum in the US, quote, it would also mean that Turkey could no longer guarantee the safety of the Jews in Turkey. So this is very clearly a threat to the safety of Jews in their own country where they are citizens, based on the actions of a museum of a government that they cannot control. And we know this story is for sure real because he makes the same threat later on in September 1980 to the Washington representative of the American Jewish Committee, again, with regards to the US Holocaust Museum mentioning Armenians. And the community leadership of the Turkish Jewish community basically takes up the state side, the threatening side, and tells the World Jewish Committee that the inclusion of Armenians in this US museum would put our future at stake. They think the threat is very realistic, and even if they didn't think so, which might have been the case, they agree with the government that they could use this as leverage over the US. And unlike the previous periods, especially until the 60s, Jews have kind of become resigned to their fate as somewhat unequals, but mostly are trying to hide. And the half of the community that has left the country, mostly moved to Israel, kind of highlights the shrinking and designed to be inconspicuous Jewish community at the time. We're talking about a community that has now shrunk to under 40,000 people. Their political attempts at being involved and being demanding was mainly in the Democrat Party era in the 50s, and that ended with the coup, which after the coup, they saw that having picked the wrong horse, they kind of got burned and would discourage their members from active politics after that point. So this lobby project is actually the first time when the community is stepping out of itself and starting to appear in the paper, in the press, but more outside than inside. They're more involved in foreign policy on behalf of the state as something that's above the fray, above politics, above parties, and less so domestically. While we get to the story of Jacques Camus specifically, who gets involved in, him and his son later get involved in specific party politics, that does tend to get sticky and it doesn't end well for him. It is in this period that the community reached what I would say peak kayades, maximum silence. So in the 1970s and into the 80s, we're talking about a group of people who are fully Israel-loving, supporting Jews at home, and apolitical, fully assimilated Turks outside. They are speaking Turkish in almost every part of their lives. They go to mostly Turkish schools. Even if you go to the Jewish school, the curriculum and teachers, and as we discussed in the first part, are all Turkish. And this leads me to the example that I would like to get to about this, which is Shalom, the only surviving organ of the Jewish press. The 3 or 4 young Jewish press examples we talked about in the 1940s, in 47, 48, that thrived through the 50s, didn't make it up until this point. They slowly went away, and Shalom was the only survivor. And in 1980, Shalom declared proudly that Turkey was a country where anti-Semitism didn't exist. This is a comical statement, because it speaks, of course, to not only the fooling of the self, but also the issues of, for example, class, where some people might have experienced anti-Semitism more directly, or others might have been able to escape it through wealth, but that doesn't always work, as we're going to get to. Basically, we're seeing a community that is lying both to itself and especially to the general public. And we're going to see the shatterings of that throughout this PR project that brings attention, public attention to the Jews for the first time in a while. And not all of the community appreciates this, even though it's positive and pro-government. Some members of the community think this press is detrimental, that it brings unneeded attention on who they are, what sort of political opinions they have, and extra questioning that they don't need. But also it starts being shattered by, once again, anti-Semitic events. So the main trauma of this period for our community is the 1986 attack on the Neve Shalom synagogue. This was blamed, or was supposedly done, by 2 Abu Nidal terrorists affiliated with a Palestinian organization. Their attack, first with guns and finally with hand grenades that ended up killing themselves, killed 23 people. And even today, if you go on the Turkish community's website, the only description of the event is that it was done by originally foreign terrorists. And the 2 people who were arrested, their identities were never revealed. nor were possible collaborators. So the only thing that the community and the state wants to highlight is that these people were foreign and that there was no homegrown movement of anti-Semitism that could have done such an attack. But we know that this is not the case from the press of the time and the parties of the time, first in the 70s and then later in the late 80s and 90s, that the Islamist movement is getting way more popular every day. Before the coup, they had made anti-Semite Erbakan, who we talked about last time, into a political power broker. And after the coup, even though he and his party were banned for a while, the idea of the Turkish Islamic synthesis basically became the position of the state. It was used as a way to rein in some of the ultra-nationalist elements and also the left extremism of the day, by saying basically that Turkish nationalism, previously unspokenly founded on nominal Islam, was now bringing up the second partner in its identity, that Turkishness and Islam were hand in hand and that they would bring the fabric of the country together. Of course, this only heightened the sense of outsiderness of the Jews. And you could see another picture of the damage from that day here, and another one of a news clipping. This happened on September 6th, the same day as the 1955 pogrom in Istanbul had happened. The 23 people who died included 2 Iranian Jews who were refugees in Turkey at the time. And we see the news covered the event in the same way that the community speaks about it today, that there was an Arab ambush of Jewish prayer in Istanbul. Basically, the point is to distance Turkey and Turks who are tolerant from anti-Semitism and attacks. And in doing so, we see a refutation of responsibility, I would say. So if we return to this idea of Turkey Jews as Turkey's model minority, we see the institutionalization of this narrative, especially in the late 80s and 90s. And a lot of these works are tied to the 500th year of the arrival of Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire, even though Sephardic Jews had already arrived in the Ottoman Empire before that time, and many Jews had lived in what later became the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. We see that the foundation, under support from the state and the leadership of Kamhi, the Quincentennial or 500th year foundation, which later also opened a museum, first in the Zulfaris synagogue and later in a side of the Neve Shalom synagogue, where it is today. And according to Bali, the foundation had 3 goals. One, very directly, is to publicize a positive Turkish image to American elites. This is the main function that unofficially these leaders were taking up in the 70s and 80s anyway. So they're formalizing it in this foundation in the late 80s and 90s. Then the second goal is to improve ties to Israel, between Turkey and Israel. This also requires mostly elite engagement and not really the public, especially because the military is really the forefront of Turkish-Israeli relations at the time. And finally, it's membership in the EU. That was a major talking point of Turkish politics at the time, up until the late 2000s even. And Jews, like everyone else, thought that membership in the EU would bring not only economic benefits, but also a guarantee of minority rights and a basic level of human rights and freedom of the press. So none of these 3 goals are domestic facing. This foundation and its museum are not trying to tell the Turkish public about the Jewish community. They're not trying to tell even the Turkish elites about the Jewish community and Jewish problems. Most of the goals are about telling foreigners about how good Turkey is in order to then get concessions from the Turkish government for communal benefit. So this is happening at the same time as when a lot of human rights groups, Armenian and Greek diasporic and later Armenian local organizations, are talking about the wealth tax and the pogroms that we've discussed before, and increasingly the attacks on the Kurds. And instead of doing the same, our community is taking a different path. It's pushing all of that to the side, including the traumas that we also experienced, like the wealth tax and the pogroms, and instead focusing on the Ottoman past, ignoring the first part of the talk, the 1923-1946, what I would say is the worst period of anti-Semitism in Turkey. And by focusing on this PR, mythic good relations side of things, they're bolstering the narrative that we are guests in our country, and that we are at the mercy of the gracious host, the Turks, who are tolerant towards their own citizens. So we become not citizens deserving of equal rights, but guests who are tolerated and of course have to abide by certain rules. So we see the willing construction of an unending demand for gratefulness. And the foundation, in a way, broke the silence and invisibility. So we see in the 90s, the end, I would say, of peak Kayades, and instead a pro-government, Western-aligned, somewhat of a grift that brought even more vitriol from the Islamists for being Western-aligned and intended for an American, European, and Israeli audience. All of this basically confirmed the belief of the Islamists, their conspiracy theories, that the Jews in Turkey were connected with the West and working for the West and so on. So this engagement actually drew a lot of criticism. And we see that this is happening basically at the highest levels. We see Jacques Camille and his wife next to the president at a dinner gala for the foundation. And we see people who later come to question the things they've said. For example, at the time, the lawyer Erol Dilek goes to Washington and denies the fact that Jews had ever faced any human rights violations in Turkey. For someone whose family and who himself has experienced these problems, Erol Dilek making this statement seems out of place. But these people really show us what the Jewish mentality in that time and somewhat up until the present is, that these are people speaking with two minds. Publicly in the West, in Washington especially, they're constantly praising Turkey. But then also talking to Jewish organization leaders, talking to the CEO of the ADL, talking to people from the World Jewish Congress, they're saying in private that Jews are in a tough spot. And if the US doesn't do what Turkey wants, say, deny the Armenian genocide, not mention them in the Holocaust Museum, that they'll get hurt. So they're saying publicly that everything is great, but privately they're saying they're worried about everything and everything could fall apart all of a sudden. And we see this double mind again. For example, I think this is a really clear episode of it. In 1989, Chief Rabbi at the time, David Aseo, sent a letter to all 100 members of the US Senate. And in his letter, he talks about the Turks having been great to Jews, and that tolerance is proof that there could be no such thing as the Armenian genocide. And the letter is so out of place that even the ADL chief, Abe Foxman, finds it excessive and said it was not beneficial to the cause. So we see that in the press in the 90s, Jews are told by the Turkish elite of the columnists and the newspaper editors that they should tell the world about how happy they are and how they should be useful to their country in this service. And we see according to Bali's assessment at least, which I would say I agree with, that all of this PR campaigning doesn't get the result that it wants. So the main point is that by doing this, back home, the community is going to get benefits. And the main two issues are the ban on minorities donating real estate to their communal organizations, and the other is the rampant anti-Semitism in the press, mostly more overtly in the Islamist press, but really across the board. And basically the PR campaign does not allow any of this to change. The rules about donating real estate are unaltered, and anti-Semitism in the press is basically left to happen. But what does keep happening is the confiscation of properties. This also is a story that begins earlier. So in the first talk, I mentioned that while we're going to focus on the Sephardic community, which is the community that 3/4 of my family comes from, there's also a massive population in our country. Well, not massive, but not an insignificant population of non-Sephardic Jews. Mostly I'm speaking of the Arab speaking of Antioch and Urfa, and the Kurdish speakers and the Neo-Aramaic speakers further east. And basically from 1945 up until this period, especially in the 70s and 80s, we see the towns of those areas empty out, either to Israel or to Istanbul, either for anti-Semitism or economic reasons. Basically, when we get to 2000, outside of Izmir and Istanbul, there's only a handful of Jews left anywhere else. There's no minyan that's continuous in Antioch. There's no minyan that continuous in Ankara. For example, today in Çanakkale, there's one person who's Jewish. In Edirne for a long time, there was one person. In Kırklareli for a long time, there was one person. My dad left Tekirdağ in 1973, one of the last families to do so. And the government starts to take advantage of a 1936 order about minority-owned institutions that had originally targeted mainly Greek and Armenian properties, which compared to us, they owned many, many properties. Most sections of old Istanbul, many buildings are Greek-owned. Lots of large, important business buildings in downtown Istanbul are owned by Armenians and were donated to communal institutions. But this order basically revokes those donations and puts those into government hands. So we see from 1974, which is the earliest date of these confiscations, into the 90s, the confiscation of formerly Jewish properties by the government. Some had already been in use by the government. For example, the Bergamo synagogue, recently restored, was in the 50s after the community had left, used as the offices of the orphanage organization of Turkey. And then it was left. But official ownership passed to the government. And this was for all of these. And if you look at this list, you'll see east, west, south, all over Turkey. And when it says synagogue, don't just assume that it's the synagogue itself, but it's also surrounding areas, possibly a midrash, maybe a home for the rabbi, and so on. And we see that the government is not interested in returning these. And even today, these are not returned. Some of these have been converted to museums, some of these have been restored. And the community is obviously happy about that. But official ownership remains with the government for almost all of it. So another thing to highlight in this period is the return of Erbakan. So he was banned from politics banned from politics after the coup, like every pre-coup politician, but later allowed to return, as were other pre-coup politicians. And we see that the Islamist hate is reaching a fever pitch at this time. For example, the mayor of Urfa, a major southeastern city, repeatedly calls for the explicit mass murder of Jews in 1988. This is quite unusual. Such explicit calls weren't really made since the 40s. But the Islamists really are heralding a change in the nature of Turkey's anti-Semitism. And it somewhat goes unnoticed by the mainstream Jewish community. The leadership obviously is aware of it and is interested in stemming it. But basically, we see that the Jews and the Islamists don't cross paths. The places where the Islamists are strongest, the Jews don't live. Their class structure often doesn't overlap. In the 80s and 90s, as the Turkish economy opened up, Jews were able to secure massive wealth off of that liberalization. We see the economic position of the community improve to its peak at this time. Basically, in the first period we talked about, 1923, 1946, Jews had been the urban poor. And in 46 to 80, that somewhat continued. But once we get to the 80s and 90s, that is no longer the case. Most Jews are usually middle class, lower middle class maybe, but more Jews are becoming upper middle class. And why are they able to do this? Because they had education and language skills just at the right time when the economy started to open up. And the main thing that was useful was being able to export and import. And basically, distributorship licenses and export licenses and import licenses allowed Jews to take advantage of the liberalization to improve their lot. So if we talk about wealthy Jewish merchants from before, we're talking about a few people. There were not that many wealthy Jews in the 20s, 30s, 50s, 40s. But when we come to this time, there's way more people who are well off. Like in the 20s, you could name all of the families who are wealthy. Then later on, it's not as possible. For example, we see Jews shifting their summer plans from Heybeliada, a more modest place where most people are renters, towards Büyükada, where people are buying second homes and a Jewish summer life is flourishing. A place where the Jewish community is seeing itself and talking to itself more than while they're in Istanbul, while they're existing mostly in Turkish majority settings. And once we see this situation, it makes sense that they're trying to ignore a lot of the negative developments. They're less interested in seeing, oh, like what does this person in Urfa say? What does this person in Konya say? And they're more interested in just going about their business, not trying to ignore the problems that they're trying to face. And the leadership obviously is alarmed. And we see this come to a head in 1994 when the Islamists win elections for mayor in Istanbul and in Ankara and in many other major cities. And then we see the realities start to set in. So we see at this time also immigration slowing down, mostly for this material reason, because when the economic lot is good and you don't see the anti-Semitism day to day, there's not really much incentive to leave the country of your birth. So immigration is at a lull. So it really comes as a surprise to a lot of people that Islamists are this successful as well. We're talking about a Jewish community that is avowedly secular, which is what the state really was cultivating for its Muslim and non-Muslim citizens. We're talking about a community that is secular in its outlook on politics, that not only because they're Jewish, but because they prefer a government that is not religious. So this kind of, again, is shattered through a few events. And the one I want to talk about first is unfortunately something that happened this week, 17 years ago, on August 21st, 2003. This young dentist named Yasef Yahya was at his dentist office. hung up the phone with his mom, and then some men walk in. He assumed they were his patients. Unfortunately, they were attackers who saw the name Dentist Yosef Yahya, thought he was Jewish, and decided to murder him. This was originally tried as a murder, but then as an act of terrorism. And there isn't really much more to say about this case, except it really shows the reality of the sort of country that Turkey was becoming. Of course, this sort of thing is extremely unusual. This is perhaps the only case where such a thing has ever happened. So mostly, day to day, Jews aren't really thinking about things like this. But then it also begs the question of what is the cultural and political environment that allows for this sort of thing to start, to begin with. This was random murders of people for being Jewish was not really something that happened before. And 3 months after this murder, we also see the twin synagogue attacks in Neve Shalom and Sisli. Left is Neve Shalom, right is Sisli. The Neve Shalom synagogue had been attacked already in the March of '92 and also in '86, as we have seen. And this time, the attack was way more deadly. 300 people were injured. A total of 28 people were murdered. And ultimately, Al-Qaeda took responsibility. But to highlight, this case was much more broadly investigated. And it was a more elaborate operation. These 2 bombings were followed by 2 other bombings 5 days later of the HSBC building and the British consulate. And we see that 3 of the 5 ringleaders were Turkish this time. And this information was disclosed to the public, including their names. They're available on the Wikipedia page of this bombing, if you are so inclined. And we see that the Turkish public's approach to the Jewish community and the Turkish public's ideas of the Jewish community are changing and radicalizing in ways that are new. And a famous story from this event that I think shows agency on the side of Jews is important, is that of Yoel Cohen Ulcher, who was a volunteer security guard in a synagogue. And he notices something off with a delivery van looking vehicle, and tells it to not come any closer. This ends up being the bomber car, and him holding that off actually ends up saving a lot of people's lives, though he himself dies because of this. And we see, basically, I think Yoel Cohen Ulcher, a hero. We see him stand up for his people, be involved in his communal organizations, and at the same time, be aware of the dangers. So I think his story kind of speaks to the realities of Jews day to day while they go to high school and learn the Turkish curriculum and study for the Turkish university placement exam, are also involved in communal institutions, possibly in the Jewish Youth Culture Center as teachers, possibly in positions like this, but are generally at least somewhat aware or interested in who they are, in their community, and in their institutions. There's another photo from that day. And something I want to mention especially is the school. So previously we talked about various Jewish schools and the policies that affected them. But when we come to this period, much like Shalom, the only Jewish school left is what is called initially the Galata Jewish School, but later on the Ulus private Jewish school. It moves to the Ulus area in 1994 and changes its name officially in 98. And it's important to highlight the main change, not just in location, but also in numbers. So actually, it's not that having one school is not enough. That's not the reason that I want to highlight that it's the only left. It actually is a reasonable consolidation of our communal funds and communal efforts. So while we see generally immigration slowing down at this time until the 2000s, really, we also see the decline of the strength in numbers. For example, most people who went to school in the 80s and definitely in the 70s went to state schools for primary, middle, possibly high school, but almost never were they the only Jews, because they often lived in Sisli or Galata or Kurtuluş or wherever, and we see them having other Jewish classmates, first of all, but also Armenian classmates, Greek classmates. They're never the only other in the room, and that provides some sort of basic security. In the 2000s and late 90s, we see this go down. For example, in the year I was born, in 1997, which I know for many of you is extremely recent, there were only about 100 Jewish kids. So that's the extent of the community we're talking about. So of course, one school for the maximum possibility of 100 people in one grade is quite enough. And not all of those people go to the one school. So we've really, we've really gone from a community that is somewhat large and has a specific area where it's concentrated in, to a community that first shrank rapidly, became politically active, then became politically inactive, then tried to become a close ally of the government, even though it didn't work out, then is noticing changes in how it's perceived, and it tries to stop them somewhat, but the efforts don't seem to pan out. And something that I struggled with with this presentation for today is the lack of resources on the current period, because basically from the bombing in 2003 to the present, there's not really written history yet. But I think the change in attitude is going to become clear from two examples. So these both happen after the lay president changes. So the new lay president and the current co-lay president is Isacc Zadeh, and under his leadership, we see the inklings of a change. One of them, I think, is quite massive, the one on the left, and the one on the right is just as important, though not as known. So the first one is, in 2015, the Jewish community, along with a municipality, for the first time organizes a public Hanukkah celebration. And this happens in Ortaköy. And it was once canceled and then happened again. This year it happened in Galata, near Neve Shalom and La Kula that we discussed before. And basically, a public celebration of Hanukkah was sort of unprecedented for everyone alive, I would say, in 2015. That possibly hundreds of people would gather to support a Jewish holiday in a major public square, And you see here the Ortaköy Mosque, which is iconic because it's right by the bridge, this was a massive development. This was a huge change from the inconspicuousness and the invisibility. And of course, many criticized this decision, that they wanted to remain inconspicuous, that it wasn't good to be so out in the open, that maybe this would have been dangerous. But nonetheless, it happened, and it went off without a hitch, I would say. And it started to change perceptions. The one on the right, also important, is our commemoration of Struma and its sinking. This was one of the ships carrying people away from Romania, escaping the Holocaust, and it had been staying away from Istanbul's coast. It was not let in, was pulled back out to the Black Sea, sunk by a torpedo, likely from a Soviet submarine. And as of 2015, there are annual commemorations for this, where the chief rabbi and a government official throw flowers into the water where the ship once stood. So these are huge changes for our community's self-perception and the way it communicates to the outside world. Something I didn't have time to get into, connected to Struma, is the narrative of Holocaust consumption and memory appropriation by the government. So if people are interested in that, we can discuss that later, and you can email me. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a similar initiative that I wasn't in, that I am involved in myself, which is Altaras. And that is another way of seeing this invisibility and Kayade's issue of younger Jews and non-Jews coming together to discuss the history of Jews in Turkey and their anti-Semitism in Turkey, in order to highlight both our reality and also our existence. And I think slowly there's some discussion within our community to say, has invisibility worked for us? How long will it work for us? What sort of things could we change? And I know that was a lot of things again. And there were many more things that I couldn't mention. So I'm really interested in your questions. I've heard so many great questions throughout this series. Thank you so much.
Okay, Nesi, thank you so much for a great third presentation. Let's just fix that 1 second. Okay, great. I just remind everybody, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat box and we'll ask it out and try to get to as many as we can while we still have time this evening. So Nesi, first of all, thank you so much for a really fascinating 3-part series. I wanted to first ask you, maybe you can comment a little bit on kind of the modern, from the 1980s till today, kind of the change in terms of identity within the Jewish community of Turkey, how it's kind of changed from seeing itself as this very fundamentally Sephardic community to kind of more genericizing its Jewish identity in terms of like not emphasizing Sephardic, but just saying we're Jewish, let's focus on the Jewish elements.
I don't know if that's the case. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess, I don't know if previously people emphasized that heavily. I think that might have to do with this intermingling that I kind of hinted at with the confiscation of properties question of basically these non-Sephardic elements in our community have fully integrated. Like one of my grandparents is a Neo-Aramaic speaker and her family's from Van. Many people have grandparents from Antakya, Antep. Antep is maybe a bigger one even. And of course, there's all sorts of Romaniot last names. And basically what I'm trying to say is that the Sephardic nature of the community has kind of gone off with the decline of the language, of course, the decrease in Ladino, but also the integration of non-Sephardic elements into the community that really happens seamlessly, I would say. More so than the separation with the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi, which even today is somewhat real.
Okay, what else do we have here? Could you maybe comment on what percentage of the Jews in your generation in Turkey still tend to know Ladino?
Oh, 0%.
Or maybe you can nuance a little bit more. Knowledge of Ladino, they know what it is. Do they know words and phrases? Do they speak it fluently? What's kind of the level, the baseline level?
Okay, yeah. So fluency in Ladino, 0. But knowledge of culture and at least a few proverbs, definitely 10, 20, 30, 100 words. Yes, I think that would be very common. At least everyone knows the most important swear words. Definitely names of food. I feel like the most commonly known verb would be disho, which is he, she, says. I think that might be the most commonly used verb, though conjugation, I think, escapes most people. So definitely, like, there's an interest and a basic knowledge of the language for sure. I would, yeah, but what I mean is fluent knowledge.
And maybe another question here, could you comment a little bit on kind of the modern relationship with the State of Israel, Turkey, and the Turkish Jewish community?
Yeah, so that is a huge can of worms that I would say am not qualified to discuss at length. But what I'll say is, I think even when the Turkish-Israeli relationship was positive, the Turkish-Jewish community was very hesitant to publicize its support or liking of Israel. So like throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, Turkey and Israel had a close relationship, at least strategically. Even as late as the mid-2000s, Shimon Peres, as president of Israel, gave a speech in the Turkish parliament. Erdogan went to the Knesset. These things were normal. Turkey and Israel had all sorts of military relationships. Even at that point, at this high point, I think the community was always silent or inside voice in terms of its affinity with Israel.
Request here from a native Turkish speaker is that can you maybe comment on your article on Altaras today?
Today, to my knowledge, I didn't write anything today.
Maybe in the past few days, perhaps.
Oh, so I think the most recent thing I've written, I write for it a lot. The most recent thing I've written was about the Google searches we receive and what sort of terms we get. So a lot of the terms we get are actually, is X famous person from Turkey Jewish? And especially one recent one is a rising politician on the center right, and people keep asking, is he Jewish? Is his dad Jewish? Is he a Sabbateist former Jew? Is he a crypto Jew? All these sorts of questions. And basically what I said was that these questions kind of show us what the Turkish public is asking Google and then ending up on our website, because they're wondering, I like this person, but are they Jewish, just to be sure? So that kind of shows us that being Jewish is not perceived to be positive at all. It's a major negative. Yeah, so that's basically the crux of what I was trying to say.
Another question over here. Under the AKP around 2010, there was a Kurdish opening, an Armenian opening, a Roma opening, etc. Was there a Jewish opening as well?
Well, this is in my wheelhouse. My previous thesis was about the Kurdish question. There was no Jewish opening, but I don't know if the Jewish community needed or merited an opening. Our problems are not really the anti-Semitism problem. Obviously, is social, but the problems of the community are really beyond the Turkish public. The Turkish public doesn't really care about the confiscated properties or our approach to history. These are things that the government could really fix by itself. It's a problem of elite perception. So this is not the case with the Armenians and the Kurds and the Roma, where there would be public opposition if the government tried restitution for those groups. So I think there wasn't, and that makes sense to me.
The question in the chat. Was there any backlash after the Mavi Mamara incident that you mentioned?
Okay, see, this is the sort of thing that I didn't want to get into as a random events without a historical narrative around them. And of course, I mean, I remember it so clearly. First, the Davos event, and then that. I think maybe 10 years from now, we'll be able to better contextualize and understand those. But obviously, the short answer is these, first the Davos thing, and then the Mavi Marmara incident, where a Turkish flotilla was boarded by Israeli soldiers and who ended up shooting at people on it, and 9 people, I think, ended up dying, caused a massive backlash on the Jewish community. Huge uptick in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic graffiti, anti-Semitic talking points in all sorts of press, newspapers, TV. Obviously had a negative impact on our lives. And since then, I would say, most people talk about, the Turkey experts talk about that area, that time, as a canary in the coal mine for the current government and what sort of direction it would take. And it was really the high point that, like, that up until that point was one thing, and then and later on, since then, has been more of a downward slope.
Wow, we're getting a lot of great questions here. Thank you all so much. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Is there a sense of, today, is there a sense of solidarity between Jews and Greeks and Armenians and other minorities in Turkey?
I think that's something that makes me hopeful, that's something that's developing. And it's been developing for maybe 15-ish years. I think, again, Rifat Bari summarizes this with the beginning of Armenians trying to establish solidarity with leftist groups and Kurds, and then that has expanded outwards, because at the same time, Kurds were also looking for solidarity from others. And we're seeing the popularization of the term Türkiyeli to mean of Turkey as opposition to Turk, in order to say not everyone in this country is a Turk, mostly meaning Muslim, but also Turkish speaker, of which we originally were neither. So that this term would make us, would include us, and also could create a new national identity that would finally put us basically in a first-class position, as equals to Türkiyeli Türkler, Turks of Turkey, and Kurds of Turkey, Armenians of Turkey, Jews of Turkey, etc. So I think that work is being done every day now. Of course, it's a hard time to do such work, but I think that has become a new thing. For example, when the Armenian community began for the first time in its recent history a demonstration and sit-in to recover one of its confiscated properties, a number of Jews went in solidarity. So I think that in 2015 is a huge change from before. And things like that are only increasing. More and more, unlike the previous situation, we're seeing Jews not distance themselves as much from Jews, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, who have become more assertive and saying, we also exist. We're more numerous than the Greeks, which is true. Yeah.
Let's see. It is my understanding that the Turkish Jews used to give their children names that were clearly Jewish, Ishak, Sarah, Nathan, etc., but it doesn't happen as prominently anymore. When did we start seeing this change in naming?
I think in the 90s, when things were good, people started using Turkish names, which is kind of paradoxical. But I think this is not as major of an issue as people think it is. People's last names are still so clearly Jewish. And it's kind of random. It's not like all of a sudden everyone picked Turkish names. My name is Jewish. My brother's name is Jewish. All of my cousins' names are Jewish. It's like some people did it, some people didn't do it. Some people's first kid has a Turkish name, the second one doesn't. Names go in and out of style.
A really interesting question here. I want to ask you if you're hopeful about Jewish and non-Jewish relationships and collaboration in Turkey. I'm a Muslim who grew up in Istanbul and never heard about Judaism and Jews who lived in Turkey. And since I'm now living in California, I'm aware of how wrong I was and how wrong my parents were I know that I could have become even an anti-Semite if I was kept into kind of this bubble. It makes me want to learn more. What do you think about the youth in Turkey who have no idea and who probably live like this, or Chas Shalom, God forbid, may even harbor anti-Semitic tendencies?
That's a great question, and I'm really glad to hear it. I think that's really the crux of the problem, because, for example, as much work that Altaras tries to do, we can't reach those people because that's not our audience. And the real work is done by Jews existing in Turkey, meeting people, going to university where they run into people, or events like the Living Library, where people from different groups become living books, and different university students come up to them, or high school students, and ask, like, who are you? Like, what's your deal? And these could be anyone from Jews, Armenians, to like a hijabi feminist, and so on. Basically, for people to tell their stories to people they wouldn't meet. So I think stuff like that starts dialogue.
Let's see, we have one or two more questions here. Turkey's Roma distance themselves by saying, quote, "We are not like the Kurds." Do Turkey's Jews do something similar often?
I think Turkey's Jews are so far away from what Turkey's Kurds are that the comparison would be surprising to anyone. They're so numerous, we're so small. They're a majority in all the areas they live in. A lot of them, hundreds of thousands of them, speak their own language. There's not really any comparison. And the majority of the Jewish community has really eaten up any sort of national history that the government offered. So I feel like, for example, as a person who studies the Kurdish conflict, whenever I try to talk to Jews about it, they're often very resistant, almost as much as any Turk, I would say. So we're only now, maybe the last 20 years, seeing the realities of a young, new Jewish political consciousness, I would say. What does it mean to be a political person in Turkey as a Jew? And of course, I don't think I would get into trouble for saying this. It's not an easy country to be politically active. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
We'll take two more questions and then we'll probably wrap up. One question here is that I noticed that the Chabad/Ashkenazic rabbi of Istanbul has been more active in social media. Is Chabad increasing its presence? Is it becoming more popular? And have traditional Sephardic Jews, the Sephardic population itself, moved kind of towards this model?
So, okay, one of the first things I wrote for Altaras was a criticism of Chabad, for which I got an extreme amount of flack and continue to do so. It's been 3 years since I wrote this, and it's the thing that people bring up the most. No one is over it. So if this person speaks Turkish, I would love them to reach out to me, and I will send them the article and we can discuss it. Some things I've changed my mind about, many things I haven't. But I think there is an influence. I am not a fan of it. And here's what I'll say. The increase of Chabad's presence in Turkey has come at a perfect time for them, I would say, as the community was getting smaller, getting poorer, and Turkey, the rest of Turkey, the Muslims of Turkey were getting more religious. So it was a perfect time for Turkish Jews to get religious as well. So they really caught that opportunity. So that's what I'll say.
This is a really good question. I think it's a perfect question to end on. I see there's a difference in perceptions between your generation, Nesi, in regards to Turkey's heritage versus the older generation. What do you see as a way to kind of improve, as a way forward to learn lessons from the Republican era and build upon kind of the model of the Ottoman coexistence?
Something that I've heard from Mark Baer, who I interviewed for this about his book before, is that we need to stop talking about the Ottoman Empire so much as Jews in Turkey, because most of our reality today as a community is shaped by the Republic, and there's no way we can recover the realities for Jews at that time for a few reasons. One, that the rest of Turkey is different, but also we're so different. We're trying to come out of this extreme assimilation and recover a previous identity when we're so much smaller and so insular. So I think the first thing is that we need to start telling each other. For example, I was a madrih at a youth center. And one time I went in to talk, we have a regular curriculum, and 1 week we talk about the wealth tax. And I went with Rafat Bali's book of interviews with people who've experienced it firsthand, or their parents experienced it when they were children at the time, and they remember their parents being taken away, like my grandfather. And I just asked their last names, and I was like, is this your grandparent? And people were like, what? Yes, I didn't even know. I had no idea. So I think the first step is grandkids asking their grandparents, where did we come from? What happened to us? What did we do in response? How did we lose our languages, our Neo-Aramaic, our Ladino, so on. So I think a discussion amongst ourselves is the most important first step. And I mean, to some extent, this series is that, a conversation between ourselves, the Sephardic Jews of the former Ottoman Empire, in English.
I'll actually jump on that and say this is not only a conversation about the Turkish Jews who are living in Turkey today, but indeed this is a conversation that we at the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America are trying to have amongst ourselves and among the American Sephardic community, who are descendants of De los Muertos, our own Sephardic Jews originally from the Ottoman Empire. So certainly a question, I think, to really ask yourselves, and I hope you all ask those questions to yourselves, your parents, your grandparents, and have those conversations as well, but what it really means to be Sephardic and how can we perpetuate our identity. Certainly something we'll try to do through our Sephardic Digital Academy. I want to thank Nesi so much for this wonderful 3-part series. Really incredible. Hazak Ubaruch. Just to let you all know, if you could all do us a big favor, after every major series we do, we ask you to take a quick survey. I've just posted into the chat. You can find it there. It's a 2-3 minute Google form. We really appreciate taking it. It takes 2 to 3 minutes to fill out. Appreciate your feedback. Any comments you might have, we welcome them. It'll help us improve our lectures, improve our series, and make sure we are continuing to produce wonderful content that you can really love and enjoy and really get something out of. I want to thank Nesi again so much, and just remind everybody, this is all a nonprofit initiative. If you're ever interested in sponsoring a series, whether it be on Ladino, history, culture, identity, Torah, halakha, so much more, cooking as well, please reach out to us. We have a number of series actually coming up for this coming month, some very exciting ones. If you're at all interested, please email us at info, at sephardicbrother.com. We'd greatly appreciate your support. Nesi, thank you so much for a wonderful series. We really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We really love having you all here together.